Okay, social media files. We've got another video by popular demand to a certain degree. You guys seem like you like these things. They're kind of fun to do. This one comes to you via a couple things that I ran across various ways on social media outlets, as well as a conversation I had with someone who was interested in figuring out ways he could somewhat sneakily change muscle fiber type through training, for instance resistance training, in hopes of creating thus faster muscle, which could then be employed in strength and power sports like baseball and football. And it's not the first time I've gotten this type of question. It's a common one, and it makes sense that you'd want to try to do that. But preceding any of those types of strategies, one's first going to have to understand what muscle fiber types actually mean. What do we mean when we say these? And this is something I've seen since the beginning of internet time, essentially since the mid-90s, folks throwing around terms, sometimes knowing to what they're referring and other times not. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline to help you understand these things. And if it helps you in some way kind of cut through some technical jargon that someone's using to maybe obscure something they're not really all that knowledgeable about, or to make the rest of their argument sound a little more fancy than maybe it really is, then this would be purpose served for me, and you may actually just enjoy this information. I think it's kind of cool. So the first thing to know about muscle fiber types is that a lot of this work was originally done in animals, rodents specifically, although you can do fiber types in quails and other animals, of course. And rats are physiologically different than humans, in that they will tend to have, especially in the most studied muscles, the locomotor muscles, below the knee, or the plantar flexors and the dorsiflexors, they will tend to be somewhat specialized in terms of their fiber type. Meaning that, for instance, in the rat, you've got a soleus muscle, which will be 90%, maybe even more, type 1 fiber. And I use that term specifically, you'll see what I mean by that in just a second. Whereas in humans, you might see, of course, that soleus being a sort of a postural muscle, you're going to have a higher percentage of type 1, but you won't see this sort of almost exclusivity amongst muscle fibers, such that those entire muscles are made of one fiber type. So that is something to keep in mind. So with that historical piece of information, what people first started noticing, of course, was in doing work with animals, exercise training studies, what have you, any sort of an intervention, you would find that you would have, sorry for the shakiness there, red and white muscle. So you might see a red gastrocnemius and, a red soleus and a white gastrocnemius. In fact, if you looked at the gastrocnemius, you might see part of it is white and part of it is red. And the reason for this red coloration is at least twofold. One, you're going to have a higher amount of a heme-containing protein called myoglobin in red muscle fibers. And that's to basically hand off oxygen that's brought to the muscle via hemoglobin in the blood, such that it can create a little bit of a storage form, so to speak, harbor a bit of oxygen attached to that myoglobin, and then hand that off to the mitochondria for oxidative phosphorylation. Whereas in white muscle, you don't have that myoglobin, at least not large amounts. And another difference here, of course, just excising these muscles, you'd see this one is highly capillarized, so it's going to have a lot more blood in it. So it's going to be red versus white. Well, obviously with this one having myoglobin and the extra capillaries, you're going to tend to find these are going to be more oxidative. Oops. and this would be because of enzyme levels. I'm not going to write all those out. These will tend to be more glycolytic. So we're going to have, for instance, higher levels of oxidative enzymes like succinate dehydrogenase or citrate synthase, or even like a cytochrome C in the electron transport chain, because these have more mitochondria, whereas these fibers are going to have higher levels of the glycolytic enzymes like phosphofructokinase, for instance. So that tells you about their ability to supply energy and the enzymatic pathways with which they do. So note, this is simple color, red and white. This is an enzyme differentiation. Then we can also look at the physiological properties of these. So this might be very fatigue resistant. Fatigue resistant. And these might be fatigable. Okay, so if you take those muscles in isolation and force them to contract with electrical stimulation, you're going to find that these red oxidative muscles like the soleus are going to tend to be fatigue resistant, whereas the white glycolytic muscles like portions of the gastrocnemius are going to be more fatigable. Okay, these are also going to be faster. If we look at the twitch property, so you send a singular impulse or you force that muscle to contract in an experimental setup, allows you to do so, and you're going to have a very fast twitch, whereas here you're going to have a slower muscle. Okay, so all these things tend to go together, and you will see these, at least initially when they're being measured, measured with whole muscle. Now, of course, you can, the whole muscle modulate, they grind these things up. So these are 4 different ways of characterizing, simple ways of characterizing muscle fiber types. We also found, however, in the gastrocnemius that there will be a red gastroc and a white gastroc. So that white gastrocnemius, that red gastrocnemius would be an intermediate form. Okay. And again, this is sort of the template that set up our paradigm for understanding muscle fiber types. Okay. Well, as it turned out, of course, people want to go a little further than this and look at individual fibers, what's happening to fibers as you train them in terms of oxidative content and glycolytic content, et cetera, et cetera. And to do that, one way you could discriminate 3 different fiber types was to look at the myosin ATPase. Okay. And if you incubated a sliver of muscle in cross section at different pHs, then you could differentiate between what would then being called type 1. I should put this over here. Yeah, leave it there for now. We're going to have to erase some of this. Type 2A and type 2B in rats. It's very important I said it that way. So this was a way of using myosin ATPase to come up with 3 different fiber types, and you can see those fairly clearly depending on the amount of stain that you produce when you perform this histochemical assay. And you do a pretty good job of matching these up, but it's very important to note that this is stuff these are measurements, these are fiber types that are determined in animal muscle. Humans aren't going to have one muscle that's red, maybe a postural muscle somewhere, but you're not going to see this differentiation as clearly as you would. So these terms are used synonymously when they're actually not. This is color, this is enzymatic capacity, this is physiology, fatigue resistance, this is speed of contraction, and this is the myosin ATPase. What happened then, using the stain that was developed for animal muscles, is they started applying the same stain to biopsies taken from human muscles and using the same terminology. If you look back, I think you can go back 20 years for sure, and maybe even more recently than that, you'll see many studies that reference these fiber types in humans. Well, as it turns out, if we look a little bit more closely at the actual myosin, particularly the myosin heavy chain, we'll see that this myosin heavy chain that was in rat 2B fibers really is not to be found in normal skeletal muscle of humans. Okay, rats actually have 2X myosin heavy chain. It's supposed to be an X. It's kind of a funky looking X. And 2B, whereas humans have 1, 2A, and 2X. Okay? So there is really no 2B, at least where you typically take biopsies in humans. You just simply won't see that. What you can also find then, if you are very fine with your staining procedures, is you'll find fibers that will be 2AX. So these will stain to a different degree. So this is a colorimetric assay. The extent to which a stain appears is representative of the myosin heavy chain in there. So these are myosin ATPase analyses, histochemical. What we can also do is use gel electrophoresis and actually look at the amount of myosin that's there. So now we're quantifying the myosin. And what you will find is, for instance, typically with increased activity in humans, we see less of this, and this goes up. So there's probably going to be, I'm going to erase this here, a shift from 2X to 2A, and you're going to see more of these 2AX fibers increase as this shift occurs. So what's happening is that part of the adaptation to the exercise training is a shift in the myosin, probably for the sake of efficiency or economy. This is very fast myosin. This is not quite as fast, but there are other advantages here. Things can get a little tricky now. Let's forget the gel electrophoresis and actual measurement of the myosin. It's a way to quantify that, although it's more really a qualitative type of analysis. We can also find things that seem to violate this perfect sort of a trifecta of 3 fiber types. For instance, a study that I was involved with years ago, we did with cyclists. We found that if you compared the type 1 and the type 2A fibers, and what we could do was take serial sections. So if these are your muscle fibers in a biopsy that you've lined up, and you take a section and take another slice, just like slicing bread, chip, you can then analyze with one slice what the myosin is, and analyze the next slice what the oxidative enzymes are. And in this particular case, there were many interesting instances of this, and actually on average this was the case that these cyclists, these were highly trained cyclists, had more succinate dehydrogenase in their type 2A than in their type 1s. So these supposedly most aerobic oxidative fibers did not display that in terms of the enzymes of oxidative phosphorylation. So this reflects the extent to which you can have tremendous plasticity of muscle across these fiber types. And what actually we find is that, and you see this here, this idea of a 2AX fiber, is that as activity creates a shift in the myosin content of muscle, you see myosin heavy chain, you see blends, basically. You see intermediate fibers that are predominantly one type of myosin heavy chain, some that have more of a different kind, and this firm delineation between type 2 and type 1 really starts to fade. This is an artificial compartmentalization with historical reasons to do so. And it's a nice way to account things, nice way of doing the accounting. But physiologically speaking, we have a very malleable or plastic, as the term goes, tissue here in skeletal muscle. So we see a shift that moves here to here. There's also some interesting things. Typically, myosin heavy chain, I'll spell that out for you. Oops. I'll try to spell it out for you. You'll see this typically abbreviated that way, sometimes this way too, if you need to use that for search terms. Myosin heavy chain is highly predictive of contractile properties, force velocity properties, which I covered in a previous video. And there's actually a study that was out of Ball State, Trappy was the first name, where they found that strength training with older folks created a shift, as you might expect, and in this older muscle to stronger force production. In fact, they had an increase in the relative force production per cross-sectional area. So the fibers themselves became intrinsically stronger and faster, and this could not be explained by the myosin heavy chain. I think that was a study from, it's in the last decade or so, I believe. So we don't typically see that in the single fiber analyses that have been done with, that I'm aware of at least, that have been done with younger individuals, but that happens in older folks. So there's a plasticity that is retained even in age. And there's another interesting study that if you really want to dig into this, you can go to mountaindogdiet.com, John Meadows' site. And I've got a 2-part article there on, I think the title is So You Think You Know Muscle. And we see some other fascinating things. For instance, they had one particular study by Stevenson. It was in 2006. Whoops. And in this study, they looked at the specific tension, which is the force per unit cross-sectional area of the type 1s and the type 2s. And because they were doing single fiber now, so you can actually tease out a singular fiber and do force velocity or force production measurements on it, which is pretty cool. One fiber at a time. These are itsy bitsy fibers, like 50 microns in diameter. Itsy bitsy small, very small. That's about 6 red blood cells across, something like that. And in this particular study, they found that there was a less force per unit cross-sectional area in the type 1s than the bodybuilders. But if you look at the type 2s, they had greater force per cross-sectional area. The idea being, of course, that they were relying upon these type 2s for training, because those are the latter ones to be called upon, than the untrained individuals. So that's a bit about fiber types for you. One thing I'll add, maybe this will be a segue into the next one that I do. The idea is just keep flowing. Is that typically we see, in terms of recruitment, as force increases or power increases or effort levels go up, we start here with these types of fibers. They're called low threshold. Oops. Motor units, so motor unit being the alpha motor neuron and the fibers it innervates. These are activated at a low threshold, and as exercise becomes more difficult, or you lift heavier and heavier weights, or you start to reach fatigue, you progressively, according to Henneman's size principle, increase the use of these and these. So that relates to this Stevenson study in that these type 2As and 2Xs in this human muscle, these were human bodybuilders, not rodent bodybuilders, were intrinsically stronger. The specific tension was higher. So something had gone on, and that was also not explainable by myosin heavy chain either. So there's still bits and pieces in terms of the basic physiology at the single fiber level that we haven't quite figured out yet. Maybe there's someone on the cutting edge who's got all the answers. I hope not, because in science we get boring. but there's still some bits and pieces to be teased out. And the main piece I want you to know here is that this categorization of fibers in these different ways really needs to be addressed when you're talking about what you mean in terms of a fiber type, and also recognize that there's limitations in even referring to fiber types per se. So, thanks for listening.